And now it's my pleasure to introduce our guest, Edward Lodi. He's a local Middleborough author and publisher. I'm sure many of you know Ed. And he has a new book out called The Who, When, Where in King Philip's War. So please help me welcome Ed.
I want to thank Libby for inviting me, and I want to thank everyone for showing up this evening. Before I begin, I just want to show you my crowd control here. Actually, there are several people in the audience that have heard me speak before. I think they keep on coming until I get it right, I guess. But they've heard me say this before. I don't use this as a head breaker. I use it as an icebreaker, just to sort of ease into the subject of King Philip's War, which, as some of you are aware, is the bloodiest war ever fought on American soil in terms of percentage of population killed. I mean, obviously the Civil War in absolute numbers was bloodier, but the King Philip's War was much bloodier in percentage of population killed. And also it was probably the most destructive war too. By the war's end, over half the buildings in New England had been destroyed, not only houses and barns, but mills, which were important to the economy. By war's end, the Indians had been devastated. They had been really destroyed forever as a power in New England. And the English were set back. At the end of the war, there were hundreds of disabled veterans, hundreds of widows and orphans. It took a full 100 years for the economy to fully recover. It wasn't the war was 1675, ended roughly around 1677. It wasn't until 100 years later, at the beginning of the American Revolution in 1775, that the average household income in New England was equal to what it had been before the war. So you can see that it was a very bloody, destructive war, and important in other ways too. So it's been called America's Forgotten War, which is unfortunate because it's important for a number of reasons, one of which is the way the English and the Europeans learned to treat the Indians. Prior to King Philip's War, in New England at least, the two cultures had lived more or less in peace side by side. But after the war, it was really, you could see the expansion westward. The Indians were seen merely as an obstacle, not a culture to mingle with, but obstacles to be removed. What I'd like to do is, before I give a brief overview of the war, is just a description of my book, and then I'll get back to the War Club. Who, When, Where in King Philip's War. As the title suggests, it's primarily a reference book. There are two main sections, a chronology or a timeline, almost a day-by-day description of the events that occurred, certainly battles and major skirmishes, but other events too that were important in the war. And the second part of the book is an alphabetical listing of about 450 individuals that were important in some way towards the war. Certainly military leaders on both sides, but others as well. I tried to balance between Indians and English as much as possible. Of course, the Indians didn't have a written language, and they lost the war. The English won the war, and they're the ones who wrote the history. So there's a lot about the Indians that we don't know, but we do know a great deal. And I try to give a balance in the book between the Indians and the English. I also included as many women as possible. A few years ago, I came up with a book called Women in King Philip's War, in which I profiled a number of prominent women or women who were important in some respect. For example, there were 3 squaw sachems, so-called squaw sachems. These were women who were sachems. Among the English society, women had no role whatsoever. Women had no rights. A woman couldn't even own property. The only woman that could own property was a widow. And that if she remarried, her husband took control of her property. Women had no say in matters. Women couldn't live alone. They had to live under the governance of a man, their father, their brother, their husband, or someone. That was not so among the Algonquin Indians. Of course, all the New England Indians were members of the Algonquin-speaking group, women did hold positions of authority. And the three women that I mentioned, I include, of course, in this current book, but whom I profiled in my previous book, were Awashonks of the Sakonets, Weedamo of the Pocassets, and Queopin of the Narragansetts. So I try to include as many women. I have other women in the book, too. Some of them were victims, some of them played other roles. And I also try to include as many children as possible. Perforce, it being a bloody war, the children in the book are all, more, to one extent or another, victims. Philip's son, for example, we don't know his name, so I included him under the letter X. I told you it's an alphabetical listing, X for unknown. He was 9 years old when he was captured with his mother at the end of the war. The English at first debated what to do with him. They were going to put him to death at one point. In fact, many of the ministers were advocating that he be put to death. But finally, they decided to be merciful and sell him into slavery. I'm not sure if that was a better alternative. So we don't know his ultimate fate. There's a tradition that he probably was sent to Bermuda as a slave. There are people in Bermuda who claim to be descendants of Philip's son and an African slave. But there's also another tradition that the Reverend James Keith and his wife took the boy in, and that he eventually ended up in Martha's Vineyard. There's another tradition that he ended up around the Great Lakes, and there were a family there that claimed to be descended from him. So we really don't know. But I just wanted to use that as an example. I did include a child. I have other children. I'll just give you one example of an English child whom I included, Thomas Clark. Thomas Clark was the only survivor of the attack on the Clark garrison in Plymouth. In March of 1676, the Indians attacked the Clark garrison. Plymouth felt itself fairly safe because they were a large settlement, and they really didn't think that they would be attacked. The Clark garrison was about 2.5 miles from the center of Plymouth. In fact, it's where Plymouth Plantation is now. I believe it's where the Indian display is, where they make the dugout canoes and what have you. So you can see it was right close to the center of Plymouth, and it was taken by surprise. Everyone in the garrison was killed with the exception of Thomas Clark. He was tomahawked and left for dead. The reason I included him is he became quite noted throughout his life as Silver-Headed Tom, because his skull was crushed and he suffered an injury, but it was, I believe it was a number of years later that a surgeon was able to remove part of his skull and put a silver plate in its place, which essentially brought him back to relatively good health. And he lived to be quite an old man, but he was always known as Silver-Headed Tom. So I'm not including only military leaders, but I try to include others as well that are notable for some reason. This is a replica of a club that supposedly belonged to Philip. Actually, there's no evidence that Philip ever owned a war club. You'll see illustrations of Philip with a war club, but those are just the fanciful notions of the artist. This is a type of war club that would have been used in King Philip's War. And actually, there were 2 war clubs in existence that supposedly were Philip's. I think Greg has come up with a third one. Well, that wasn't Philip's, was it? The one you were telling me about?
Correct.
They're right, but there were 2 that supposedly belonged to Philip. One you can see in the Fruitlands Museum in the town of Harvard, and some of you may have seen it. It's got quite a colorful history. I won't go into it tonight, but it was stolen from the museum and missing for some 25 years, and then reappeared at a yard sale, and they obtained it back. And it's an authentic club, but again, no, it can't really be traced to King Philip. And the other club that was supposedly his is in a museum in Columbus, Ohio. And again, that's been authenticated as a Woodlands Indian club from the New England area at that period. But I commissioned an Indian to make this one for me. It's not an exact replica. This is made from pine. It's a lot easier to shape pine than what would have actually been used. For an authentic war club, the warrior who was fashioning it would have obtained a root burl, either a maple or elm, probably a hardwood, on a riverbank where the roots would be exposed, and then fashion a club, carving it with the grain so that this might knock a few heads. I won't test it tonight, but it would probably last for a few heads. But an authentic war club would probably last throughout the war because they were really sturdily made. Inlaid with wampum, quahog, and conch shells. This type of design shows that the club most likely would have belonged to an eminent warrior, a sachem perhaps, or some warrior who had distinguished himself in battle. So as I said, I won't actually use it tonight. I'll just put it aside. I want to give a brief overview of the war before I concentrate on, well, I will begin by mentioning someone or an incident relating to Middleborough. I had indicated before I did the talk, I think of some of the publicity, that I would be concentrating as much as possible on Middleborough this evening. Even though there's so much, we could talk for many nights in a row. There's so much information that we know of King Philip's War, and so much fascinating information. But I thought I would try to confine it as much as possible to this area. So I want to give a brief history of the war, but I'll begin with an incident that really sparked the war. You can think of the war or the events leading up to the war, or the causes of the war, as maybe a huge pile of combustible material. And the incident that occurred in Middleborough was a spark that ignited that combustible material. And I'm referring to the execution of 3 Indians by the English who were tried and found guilty of the murder of John Sassaman. There's no indication, really, there's no evidence that Sassaman was actually murdered. His death could have very well been accidental. And there's absolutely no evidence, even if he was murdered, that the 3 men who were executed were guilty of the crime. John Sassaman was a Christian Indian. He was a Massachusetts Indian. He wasn't a Wampanoag. He was a Massachusetts Indian. He had been born in Ponkapog, which is now Canton, Massachusetts, and raised as a Christian. His parents were early converts to Christianity. The Massachusetts tribe had once been a very powerful tribe, but unfortunately, they had been largely wiped out, or certainly greatly diminished by the diseases that were brought in by the Europeans. The reason the Pilgrims were able to settle in Plymouth in 1620 and John Winthrop and his Puritans to settle in Boston in 1630 is because the Indians had all died in the area. They had all died from smallpox and bubonic plague and other diseases. Otherwise, those areas had been heavily populated. Plymouth, one of the reasons the Pilgrims chose Plymouth was because there were fields that they could plant crops on, because the Indians had used those fields to plant their crops. And likewise in Boston, there were cleared areas. But the Indians, not only the Massachusetts Indians, but the Wampanoags had been largely decimated too. It's estimated that as many as 90% of the Indians living along the coast and inland for a ways had been killed by diseases prior to 1620. So one reason, or probably the main reason, why Massasoit, for example, befriended the Pilgrims in 1621 was because his tribe was greatly weakened, and he needed an ally against the Narragansetts, who were his traditional enemy. The Narragansetts at that time hadn't been affected by disease. They were just fortunate. They evidently hadn't come into contact with any diseased Europeans, and the Narragansetts was the most powerful tribe at that time in New England. So Massasoit befriended the Pilgrims. Getting back to John Sassaman, his parents, as I said, were early converts to Christianity, probably because they saw the English, in this case John Winthrop and his company landing in Boston, as a means of protection. In any case, they died in 1633 from smallpox. John Sassaman was raised in the home of an English family in Dorchester. He took part in the Pequot War, in which that was 1637, when the English annihilated the Pequot tribe, the Great Pequot Massacre, when they attacked the fortress at what's now Mystic, Connecticut, and they essentially destroyed the Pequots. Enough remains that they eventually regrouped, which is why we have Foxwood. And of course, there's a great museum there. If you haven't been to the museum at the Mashantucket Pequot Museum near Foxwood, you really should go. It's a marvelous museum. It may be closed right now. I think they had closed it for the winter. But getting back to Sassaman, he fought on the side of the English, and he also served as interpreter. Now, he was a Massachusetts Indian. The Pequots were Pequots, but they spoke dialects of Algonquin. All the New England Indians spoke dialects of Algonquin. So the languages were mutually intelligible. He married a young Pequot captive. She's believed to have been the daughter of the sachem Sassacus. We don't know that for sure. They had a daughter named Betty, for whom Betty's Neck in Lakeville is named. So if you think of Betty's Neck, if you've been there, and it's owned by the town of Lakeville now. It's a beautiful area. If you go hiking there or bird watching or whatever, hunting, it's named for the daughter of John Sassaman and this Pequot captive. Sassaman's important in relation to King Philip because he, at one point, attended Harvard. We know that he attended Harvard at least one term. He may have gone for 2 or more terms, we don't know, but he learned to read and write English. Well, he grew up in a family of an English family in Dorchester, so he could read and write English. So he had some education. In 1660, when Massasoit probably retired, I don't think he died at that point, he probably retired, his son, Wamsutta, or Alexander, took over as great sachem of the Wampanoags, and Sassaman served as his secretary. Alexander died a couple of years later under mysterious circumstances. I've got that in the book, it's in the other books. Philip always believed that he was murdered by the English, but Philip became the great sachem in 1662, and inherited John Sassaman as his secretary. Unfortunately, it's believed that at some point, John Sassaman tried to cheat Philip by writing a will and making himself heir to Philip's property. And Philip got wind of this, wasn't too happy about it, so Sassaman had to leave as he was no longer secretary. He had gone to Natick in 1641, I believe, when Natick was established. Natick was the first of the so-called praying Indian villages that Massachusetts set up for the Christian converts. By the time of King Philip's War, there were 13 such villages, 13 or 14 such praying Indian villages, where the Indians who converted to Christianity lived. They lived in houses, they dressed as Englishmen, they lived like Englishmen. It's interesting that the English didn't accept them, didn't mingle with them. Unlike the French, in New France, in what's now parts of Canada, the French actually did intermarry freely with the Indians, but the English didn't. But they did convert many of the Indians to Christianity, and they set up these these praying Indian villages. Natick was one of the first ones. Sassaman went there as a preacher. He eventually settled in Middleborough. When I say Middleborough, of course, I'm including Lakeville, because at that time, Lakeville was part of Middleborough. He settled in Middleborough, and his first wife had died. Betty's mother had died. He married Philip's niece, the daughter of Philip's sister, Amy, and the sachem, Tispiquin. Tispiquin was one of the powerful sachems of the era. He was known as the Black Sachem, because he was also a powwow or a medicine man. And of course, he was black in the sense of black magic, because the English believed that the powwows were in league with the devil. These medicine men were in league with the devil. In fact, many English honestly believed that all Indians were in league with the devil, that they were heathens, even the ones that converted to Christianity. So he's living in 1672. He came to the area. Tisbequin, I'm talking about Sassaman. Sassaman came to the area. Tisbequin, the great sachem, gave him land in the Betty Neck area. Betty married a Christian Indian named Felix. Tisbequin also gave him some land. And then in 1675, or late 1674, early 1675, Sassaman got wind of the fact that Philip was probably planning an uprising against the English, that he was going to form a coalition of the Indian tribes in New England and drive the English out. He went to Plymouth to warn the governor, Josiah Winslow. And when he went there, he pleaded with them, please don't tell anyone that I've warned you because my life won't be worth much. Well, Josiah Winslow, unfortunately, was an arrogant man. His father, Edward Winslow, had been a very close friend of Massasoit. We know that they were more than just political allies. They were actually friends. If you read the records, you can tell that the two men genuinely liked each other. And of course, there's a famous incident in which Winslow actually saved Massasoit's life. And it's ironic that Winslow's son, Josiah, and Massasoit's son, Philip, were bitter enemies. These two men that had been close friends, their sons were bitter enemies. So Josiah Winslow, being rather arrogant, dismissed Sassaman as, well, that's nonsense. We don't have anything to worry about with Philip. And he mentioned the fact to a number of people that Sassaman had warned him. Sassaman disappeared in January. In February, his body was found in Lake Assawampset under the ice. The English believed that he had been murdered. Now, there's no evidence that he was indeed murdered. There were bruise marks around his neck. So the English saw that as evidence that there had been a struggle and he had been strangled. But evidently, forensics tells us that drowning victims, people who drown in ice by falling through the ice, often have these bruise marks because they struggle to get above the ice. A Christian Indian named Patuxent came forward and said that he had witnessed the crime, that he had seen 3 Indians murder Sassaman. And he named the 3 Indians. Tobias was one of them. They were counselors of Philip. It just so happens, though, that Patuxent owed them money, and it was a gambling debt. So you can see that Patuxent's testimony was probably not too reliable. He was able to wipe out his debt by testifying against these 3 men. And unfortunately, they were executed. And that was the spark that ignited the war. The war probably would have taken place. The forces had been working for a number of years, for many years. Trouble had been fomenting, and war was probably inevitable. But that was a spark that ignited it. The execution of these 3 men so enraged Philip's warriors that he couldn't contain them. The young men, he couldn't contain them. It's believed that he probably would have gone to war a year later when he could have made a coalition of the various tribes, when he could have stockpiled food and ammunition and weapons and what have you. But things got out of hand. The war began in Swansea on June 24th of 1675. That's when Wampanoag warriors killed 9 settlers from Swansea. Swansea was a relatively new settlement in Plymouth Colony, bordering Mount Hope, which is present-day Bristol, that area, where Philip had his headquarters and his main village. So the 2 adjacent communities, it was logical if war was going to start, that it might start right there, and indeed it did. This was on June 24th. The Plymouth Colony had realized that trouble was brewing, so a few days prior they had petitioned help from Connecticut and Massachusetts, and Connecticut and Massachusetts sent soldiers immediately in to help with the situation. So by the end of June, you had troops from Plymouth Colony, Massachusetts, and Connecticut, including a number of Mohegans. The Mohegan tribe from Connecticut sided with the English throughout the war, and they helped. They were instrumental in helping win the war because they were Indians who knew how to fight Indians, and the English didn't know how to fight Indians. So the war began in Plymouth Colony at that time, quickly spread throughout Plymouth Colony. Middleborough was the next settlement attacked on July 9th, around July 9th. We don't know the exact date. And eventually Middleborough was destroyed. It wasn't resettled until 1679. And I'll get back to some of the incidents and some of the people from Middleborough after I've done this so-called brief overview of the war. But I think it's important to put everything into perspective. Because when I mention King Philip's War to people, a lot of people say, oh, I know all about it. It happened in Rhode Island, or it happened in southeastern Massachusetts, or it happened in the Connecticut River Valley, or it happened in Maine. Well, of course, it happened all throughout New England, but some people don't really realize the full scope of the war, the full extent of it. Around that same time, they attacked the settlement of Dartmouth, which comprised not only present-day Dartmouth, but New Bedford and Fairhaven. Those settlements were destroyed, and then quickly spread throughout the area. Then on July 14th, Nipmucks attacked Mendon, which was a very small settlement. This was alarming for two reasons. We had not only Wampanoags fighting, but now you have Nipmucks, another powerful tribe, and the fighting was in Massachusetts because Mendon was in Massachusetts. From there, it quickly spread to central Massachusetts and then along the Connecticut River Valley. All the river tribes rose up, the Potomcucks, the Agawams, and the other river tribes against the English. So you have, for example, Deerfield was destroyed on September 1st. Brookfield on August 2nd, actually. August 2nd, August 3rd, Brookfield was attacked. Northfield was eventually destroyed. Springfield was eventually destroyed. Northampton was attacked. Hadley was attacked. Hatfield. So you had the war had spread now into the Connecticut River Valley, which saw some of the fiercest fighting. In the meantime, on September 5th, Abenakis attacked in Maine. So now you've got the Abenakis involved. It wasn't a coordinated battle. I mean, Philip didn't negotiate with the Abenakis and say, come on, let's all join forces. But it was just the sparks, kind of the conflagration spread, and all the Indians now, more or less, were involved. The only tribe that was able to remain neutral throughout the whole conflict, the only major tribe was the Penacooks. They were the major tribe that more or less remained neutral. I say more or less because some Penacook warriors did go join the enemy, but officially the Penacooks didn't fight. The Mohegans fought on the side of the English. Eventually the Niantics, they remained neutral for a while, but they eventually joined the side of the English. So there really were very few non-combatants in New England at that time. In December, the English, the United Colonies of New England, which were Plymouth, Massachusetts, and Connecticut, in 1643 they had formed a coalition, a mutual help coalition, more or less. And in 1675, in December, they decided to invade Narragansett territory. The Narragansetts, up until now, had been neutral, but the English, rightly or wrongly, believed that they would eventually enter the conflict on the side of Philip, on the side of the Wampanoags. So whether they would have or not, we'll never know, but the English decided to invade Narragansett territory, which was in Rhode Island. They didn't seek the permission of Rhode Island. They merely notified Governor William Codrington that they were coming in with an army. They asked for his assistance, but not for his permission. Rhode Island did help in transporting troops by ship to the area. The Rhode Island troops didn't get involved at that time. But now, so you have the war really throughout all of New England, including Rhode Island. Of course, Rhode Island eventually was almost entirely destroyed. Just a couple of settlements, Newport primarily, survived. Most of Rhode Island was destroyed by the end of the war. So you have the largest army ever assembled in New England. It was over 1,000 Englishmen, the combined forces of the colonies, and roughly 200 Indians, mostly Mohegans, some Pequots. There were a few remaining Pequots. There's a lot of detail, but essentially they attacked the Narragansett Fortress in what's the area of now South Kingstown, Rhode Island. It was a fortress that the Narragansetts had built in the swamp They thought they were safe because the swamp was impregnable, impenetrable, not impregnable, impenetrable. However, it was one of the coldest winters on record. In December was extremely cold that year. So the English were able to actually cross over the ice. The swamp froze over, so they were actually able to attack the fortress and destroy it. It was the bloodiest, the greatest battle ever fought in New England, and it lasted for hours. The English suffered heavy casualties, quite a few hundred, at least 200, probably more, killed. The Narragansetts suffered even more, not only warriors, but once the English did breach the fortress and got into the fort, they deliberately set fire to the wigwams, which were harboring hundreds of women and children, and they burned to death. So we don't know how many died, anywhere from 300 to 800 women and children. We don't know. The Narragansetts were sheltering a lot of Wampanoag women and children, so many of them died in the fire. And then the English retreated to what's now Smith's Castle. Anyone been to Smith's Castle? Have you heard of Smith's Castle? It's in Rhode Island. Name of the town. It's near Smith's Castle. Oh my goodness! I'm gonna have a senior moment here.
Not Kingston.
No. Wickford. Wickford. Is that it? Yeah. The Little Alice, what's the artist colony in the Wickford? Okay, that's where it is. It's Wickford. I seen a moment there. It was a garrison house, belonged to Richard Smith. He was an early settler and a trader. He had traded with the Indians and set up, there was a garrison house there. It was destroyed in 1676, but rebuilt a couple of years later, and it's still there now. And it's a nice museum if you ever get a chance to go there. What's notable about it now, though, is there's a mass grave, and there's a marker on the mass grave where 40 of the English soldiers who either died during the battle or died on the way back from the battle are buried in this mass grave in King Philip's War. So that's the extent of the war. It raged on. I don't want to go into a lot of detail. I do want to talk about Middleborough. But the war, you can see that the war is occurring all over New England. It's extremely bloody. The English are blundering into one massacre after another. You have Bloody Brook, you have Beers massacre, you have Wheeler's Surprise, you have a lot of massacres, Michael Pierce's blunder. The English kept on blundering. They didn't know how to fight Indians, and they didn't trust their Indian allies. Unlike Connecticut. Connecticut was the only colony that trusted Indians, and Connecticut's the only colony that didn't see whole-scale destruction. The only settlement in Connecticut that was destroyed was Simsbury in the Connecticut River Valley, a small settlement, because the Connecticut colony had Mohegans and Pequots and eventually Niantics fighting on its side, and they knew how to fight Indians. The other Indians knew this, and they knew that they couldn't trick them the way they could trick the English in the other colonies. So this war raged on, many incidents. Philip, it's believed, evidently it's questionable, it's believed that Philip went into New York to raise an army there. The common assumption is that he was able to raise an army of up to 2,000 men among the New York Algonquins, Mohicans mainly, the Mohican tribe. But that Governor Andros of New York got wind of it and persuaded the Mohawks, who were the bitter enemies of the Algonquins, to ambush him, which they did, and annihilated the army. And Philip was able to make it back to New England with just a handful of men. But had he been able to bring this army of 2,000 men that he supposedly raised, he probably would have won the war, because the Indians almost won the war. The tide didn't turn for the English until late spring, early summer of 1676, and only because the Indians had been outnumbered from the beginning, and they were running out of food. They had lost a lot of warriors, they were weakened, and they had no food supplies because they didn't have any fixed settlements the way the English did. Any questions on any of that before I talk about Middleborough a little bit more detail? Any questions? Am I just throwing too much at you? Is that it? Yes?
You keep saying they couldn't fight the Indians. Why were the Indians so much better fighters than they were?
Okay, the English were trained to fight European style. First of all, there was no regular army in New England. They were all so-called trained bands. Each settlement, each town had its own band. Every able-bodied man was required to attend training. In some cases, it wasn't very much training, but periodically they would have to learn how to use firearms and what have you. But they were used to European-style battles where you had two armies, usually on a plain, approaching each other, firing in certain formations. They had their formations, using muskets. Indians didn't fight like that. Indians fought behind trees, behind boulders, ambushed. And the English just weren't accustomed to this. They just didn't know how to fight Indians yet. They learned, they quickly learned, eventually. Ironically, the English at the beginning of the war were using inferior weapons to the Indians. They were using the old matchlock muskets. And these are very cumbersome muskets that required something like 32 steps between loading them, and they were called matchlocks because they would have to carry matches which would be lit. They had to have a fire with them at all time so that they could light the fuse to fire them. And of course they didn't work well in the rain when it was damp, and they were very cumbersome. The Indians were using the more modern flintlock muskets, which use a flint to spark it. So they were better. The Indians, for the most part, at the beginning had better weapons than the English. English quickly discarded the old matchlocks and used flintlocks. But when I say that they didn't know how to fight Indians, they weren't used to guerrilla, what you might consider guerrilla warfare. They were used to battlefields, and Indians didn't fight battle. I mean, if an Indian saw an army coming, they didn't line up and say, "We'll fight the army." They would run and then hide and ambush the army, which they did constantly. It wasn't really, it was Benjamin Church, who is probably the most capable of the English captains, who eventually persuaded Plymouth Colony to allow him to raise an army that consisted at least half, if not more, of Indians that he had captured and converted into soldiers. And it was Benjamin Church and his mixed English and Indian army that actually surprised and killed Philip in August 12th, 1676 in Mount Hope. And a couple of weeks later, he surprised and captured Anawan, who was the last of Philip's field commanders at what's now known as Anawan Rock. So Benjamin Church, in fact, just on the subject of Church, he remained as a fighter and fought in King William's War. He fought into Maine and actually into Nova Scotia. Finally didn't retire from the military until 1704. But throughout those later conflicts, he had a lot of Indian soldiers that he had captured during King Philip's War and had said, well, you know, you can take your chances on being executed or sold into slavery, or you can stay with me. And many of them remained loyal to him. But they knew how to fight Indians. So they fought in these later Indian conflicts. Yes?
You mentioned that it was the bloodiest war. Have they ever made an estimate, a rough estimate of how many people died?
Well, they figured that there were roughly 50 to 55,000 English in New England and perhaps as many as 25,000 Indians. They figure 8% of the able-bodied English, the ones who were able to fight, 8% either died or became severely disabled. But you have to keep in mind that there were many civilian casualties. It was a total war where there were massacres on both sides. I mentioned the massacre perpetrated by the English on the Narragansett Fortress. Well, the Indians also learned, previously they didn't do that, but they also massacred women and children. They never had done it before. So you had hundreds of women and children dying too from it. The estimates are out there, but they widely vary. But you can do the math, and thousands of Indians perished, and certainly many hundreds of English, more than probably thousands, not as many as Indians did. At the end of the war, the English were not happy with the Indians. They considered them traitors. So rather than enemy soldiers that were defeated, they were treated as traitors, and many of them were executed. Boston Common became an execution ground for many months afterwards, where Indians were almost daily executed, either hanged or shot. Newport, a lot of executions took place in Newport and elsewhere. Plymouth, Anawam, for example, and Tispiquin that I mentioned earlier from Middleborough, they both surrendered to Benjamin Church. He had promised clemency or amnesty to anyone who surrendered. They went to Plymouth and were promptly executed. Plymouth didn't keep the word, so you had a lot of executions going on. And then to pay for the war, it was a very costly war, and as I said, it destroyed the economy of New England. The English sold Indians into slavery to help pay for the war. And unfortunately, they sold women and children as well as men. I mean, obviously the women and children weren't guilty of anything. They didn't deserve to spend the rest of their lives in slavery, but they were sold into slavery. Ironically, they tried to sell the slaves to the Barbados and Jamaica, and the plantation owners there didn't want the Indians. They didn't want trained warriors as slaves. So the ships went all over the world. We know that some ended up in Spain, some ended up in Morocco, the Azores, for example. So some of you may have Indian ancestors. You're not aware of it because they were sold into slavery in these areas. But as I said, it destroyed the power of the New England Indians forever. They were never a formidable force again, ever. Okay, I said we'd get back to Middleborough. One of the early incidents that occurred, and it's one of my favorite stories, involves John Thompson and the Thompson gun. I know you can't see it from here, but on the picture of my book, Ghosts from King Philip's War, I've got a picture of the Thompson gun. It's a musket. And if you want to see it in the flesh, as it were, it's at the Old Colony Historical Society Museum in Taunton. It was a gun that was owned by John Thompson. He was the most prominent member of Middleborough at that time. He was born around 1616, possibly in Wales, came to New England when he was about 6 years old, and rose through society and became the most prominent man in Middleborough. In fact, he owned a farm of about 6,000 acres, which was sizable even for those days. His house was in Middleborough, but it's now, the location of his house is now in the town of Halifax, but it was part of Middleborough at that time. And his was the first house, it's believed, that was attacked and destroyed in King Philip's War. But being the most influential person in Middleborough, he was a lieutenant in command of the garrison. 16-man garrison, which was just a stroll from here, a couple hundred yards, I guess, beyond the police station a little bit, overlooking the river. When the Indians began attacking Middleborough, the townspeople all gathered into the garrison house, and the Indians gathered across the river and tried to provoke the English into coming out and fighting. Because the English were reluctant to come out and needlessly risk their lives. And there was one Indian in particular that every morning would come out and make rude gestures. I don't know what sort of gestures they were, but I guess they weren't polite gestures. But he was careful to stay out of musket range. However, John Thompson had this Thompson gun, which was a fowling piece. It was used for killing a fowl. It's 7 feet, 4.5 inches long, so it's a lot taller than I am, and had, of course, a much longer range than the ordinary musket. So what he did is he had Isaac Howland, who was his best marksman, take aim the next time the Indians started out there doing his gestures, and Howland took aim and mortally killed the Indian. Actually, there's a ghost story associated. I won't go into the ghost story tonight that I included in. It's my favorite ghost story, actually. The Indian supposedly still haunts the area, and there's other details. It's a fascinating story, interesting ghost story. But we're fortunate that the gun remained in the Thompson family right into the 1890s, when the current Thompson at that time sold it. Fortunately, the man who bought it eventually donated it to the Old Colony Historical Society, so you can see it. And I'm told that people come from all over the world to see it. It's beautiful. It looks like it was just manufactured a few weeks ago. It's in beautiful condition. It's a dog-lock musket. believed to have been manufactured in Scotland sometime between 1630 and 1650. So a real relic from King Philip's War that is worth looking at. Isaac Howland, who was the marksman that killed the Indian, I might as well mention him. He's interesting. He was the youngest of the 10 children of John Howland, the pilgrim, the Mayflower pilgrim John Howland, and the Mayflower pilgrim Elizabeth Tilley. They had 10 children. Isaac was the youngest of them. He was eventually commissioned lieutenant. I'm sorry, an ensign. He was commissioned an ensign, and he fought with under Benjamin Church throughout the war. Eventually ended up, he did a lot of things. He was a prominent citizen in Middleborough, a surveyor of highways, and that intrigues me. I just wonder what surveying highways was like at that time, but that's one of the positions he held. He was a surveyor of highways. They were building roads. I don't know what the highways were like. He was also, he kept an inn at one time, a house entertainment. He was a selectman at one time. He lived to be quite old. He died in he was born in 1649 and he died in 25. So he lived to be quite old. His brother, Jabez Howland, was another interesting person associated with Middleborough. He is believed to have been the constable who actually investigated the death of John Sassaman. He became a lieutenant under Captain Benjamin Church. In fact, he was present when Philip was killed. He was with Church when they were surprised and killed Philip. Benjamin Church wrote a book 40 years later after the war. He had kept a diary and notes, and with the aid of his son in 1716, he came out with a book, which is very readable today. It's a very readable book. But he has an amusing anecdote about Jabez Howland in it. Towards the end of the war, Benjamin Church had persuaded Awashonks, the squaw sachem of the Sakonets, to surrender. She had sided with Philip, but he had persuaded her to surrender, which she did. And William Bradford Jr. had ordered her to go to Sandwich with her tribe to await further instructions. But evidently, she got restless, or his people got restless. She wasn't there when Church went looking for her, so he tracked her down. He finally found her. It's believed around Ned's Point in Mattapoisett. There's some dispute of exactly where it was. It might have been in Fairhaven, but he was actually able to find her. What he had done is he had left Jabez Howland in charge of the main group of men. He had gone with a couple of men, and he had come upon Awashonks' tribe on the seashore, and had negotiated with her and had convinced her to come with him and what have you. But on the way back towards Jabez, he figured he'd play a trick on Jabez. It's the only humor I know of in King Philip's War. It's, you read King Philip's War, you don't burst out laughing. I mean, you try to fight back the tears, if anything. But this is the only humorous incident. Benjamin Church figured he'd play a trick on Jabez, and he had the Indians pretend to be chasing him. So he's on his horse fleeing, and the Indians are in pursuit. And he wanted to see how Jabez would react. Well, Jabez acted heroically and came up to save his captain. But and then, of course, Church said it's all a joke. And it was a big joke. That's the only humor. That's Jabez. One other man I'd like to mention in connection with Middleborough, and I find it fascinating. He wasn't from Middleborough originally. He settled in Middleborough and spent the last part of his life in Middleborough. But this was a man named John Raymond. He was from Salem. And during King Philip's War, he was a soldier in the 6th Massachusetts Company under Captain Joseph Gardner. The swamp fight, as I said, was a very bloody conflict when the English attacked the Narragansett Fortress in the swamps, known as the Great Swamp Fight or the Great Swamp Massacre. In fact, 6 English captains were killed during the assault. And you have to keep in mind that captain was the highest rank. You'll see references to major, but the major was just a captain who was appointed in charge temporarily of the group. So captains were the most prominent members usually of the community, and they were the highest ranking officers. For the English to lose 6 in the assault was quite a heavy loss. Joseph Gardner, Captain Gardner of the 6th Massachusetts Company from the Salem area, was the first of the captains killed. I mention this because John Raymond, who was one of his soldiers, was the first of the English to enter the fortress under intense fire. It was an extremely courageous act to do, obviously, to be the first to enter. A lot of his comrades were being shot down all around him. I mention this only because in 1692, during the Salem witch trials, he had to flee for his life because he was accused of witchcraft. And he ended up here in Middleborough, where he was accepted and lived for many years afterward. I think he lived until he lived to be 77, so he was quite an old man, but he chose Middleborough as a place of sanity compared to witchcraft. Salem, which was where we had the witchcraft mania. In connection with that, I'd like to mention one other man, George Burroughs. George Burroughs wasn't exactly a hero, but he certainly did credible service in King Philip's War. He was a minister around Casco Bay, the Maine area. And you have to keep in mind that Maine was very sparsely settled. In fact, I talked about the toll that the settlements suffered during King Philip's War, after King Philip's War. After King Philip's War, Maine was almost depopulated of English settlers because of the war. They were either killed or they fled the war. So they were isolated settlements at the time. During King Philip's War, Burroughs was this minister near the Casco Bay area. He heard of an attack, a nearby attack on one of the settlements, so he knew that the Indians were in the area and that his own people were in danger. So he gathered them up and people from other neighboring areas, and was able to eventually lead them to an island in relative safety. So again, he wasn't a hero, but his actions probably saved a few lives. Well, he too was accused of witchcraft in 1692, but he wasn't as lucky as John Raymond. He didn't get out in time, and he was hanged. He was one of the 19 men and women who were hanged for witchcraft. So that was the thanks that he got. I thought I'd mention that. Any comments? Questions or anything? I could go on forever here, but yes.
The story on your the Thompson gun.
Yes.
I've seen it over there at the. It's very impressive.
Mm-hmm.
We got the same story. I'm from Dartmouth.
Okay.
And we got the same story down there. So was there more than one Thompson gun, or is there just one?
The only one I know of in Thompson was, the prominent citizen here in Middleborough. So
there is a story where at the Russell's garrison, which
Mm-hmm.
is down in Paynerin Village,
right.
and there's a very short bay across to the west, and it was a place called Heathen's Neck. It's still called either Indian Town or Heathen's Neck today. And Indian doing the same thing was said, making gestures that would anger the English, and the Thompson gun came out and put the guy away.
I think you stole our story.
Well, that's why I'm asking.
Yeah.
If it was more than one gun.
Yeah, I couldn't say for certain. I don't know if anyone could, but I think, since the Thompson family did live in this area, and I think, I don't know. I'd have to really, really, really look at the evidence in the documents.
I can probably dig it up at some point.
Okay. And if you find anything to the contrary, please let me know, because I'd be interested in whatever documentation you have. But that's an interesting point. Well, yeah, there are all sorts of stories. King Philip's Cave, for example. Every town in New England has a King Philip's Cave, I believe. Certainly Simsbury, Connecticut has one, and I know that Freetown has one. I live on what was part of King Philip's Cave here in Middleborough. And it's amusing to laugh at it, but there may be a lot of truth in some of them, in that he was on the run for a number of months, moving and hiding, so he could have very well hidden in a number of caves. So some of these may be authentic caves, but again, you have these conflicting stories. Okay, yes?
I live on Tispiquin Pond,
Right.
fairly new to the area, so I started looking into the history a little bit. It looks like the name of the pond is misspelled. Is that correct?
Well, there's no such thing as misspelling Indian names, because, and I say that in all seriousness, because first of all, if you go back to the 17th century, there was no system of spelling. There was no fixed system of spelling. People spelled their own names in various ways. And there are documents. For example, Shakespeare was just a generation or two prior to this. There's a document that has Shakespeare's name in it spelled three different ways in the same document. That was quite common. People spelled words the way they sounded to them. Notoriously, the English misunderstood the pronunciation of Indian names. So you'll see it Tispequin, Tuspequin, and you'll see it various ways, and I wouldn't worry about the spelling any more than I would about John Thompson. You'll see it spelled T-O-M-S-O-N, but it's T-H-O-M-P-S-O-N. There's all different ways of spelling it. The spelling just changed. One of the men that one of my favorite characters from King Philip's War is Major Richard Waldron, W-A-L-D-E-R-N-E. Well, his son spelled it W-A-L-D-R-O-N, and that's the way you usually see it, but I keep it the way that the father spelled it. So people even, another one, Captain Samuel Mosley, and I was going to talk a little bit about him tonight. I don't think I have time. I don't want to try people's patience. But his father's name was Maudsley, M-A-D-L-E-S-Y, or something like that, whereas Mosley spelled it M-O-S-E-L-E-S-Y. There's no D in it at all, or no A or a U. So the spelling is just kind of irrelevant. Okay. But Tispequin, it was the Tispequin Street, of course, is named after the great sachem Tispequin. He was a prominent warrior. He did lead a number of raids against Bridgewater, against Scituate, and other areas. He was a formidable warrior. Unfortunately, he was executed. As I say, and his head was stuck on a pike along next to Phillips in Plymouth.
That's why I read that he was drawn and quartered.
Well, no, he wasn't drawn and quartered. The only one I know that was drawn and quartered in King Philip's War was Joshua Teft. And I'll end the talk with Joshua Teft. Joshua Teft was an Englishman who was considered a renegade by the English because he went Indian, as the saying went. He married a Wampanoag woman and lived with her, and had a number of children with her. And of course, the English were in this area were very strict Puritans, and you had to go to meeting every single Sunday. Of course, he never went to meeting. That was probably his greatest crime. But during King Philip's War, Teft, we don't know whether he actually fought on the side of the Indians or if he just sheltered with the Indians, but he was present at the Great Swamp Fight. He was seen there. He wasn't captured at the Great Swamp Fight. He escaped, but he was later captured, and he was executed as a traitor. And of course, the penalty for treason in those days was being drawn and quartered. In my book, The Angel of Hadley, I have a graphic description of I'll just briefly go over the punishment. The person was hanged, but taken down while he's still alive. His privy members were cut off, and then he was disemboweled. His guts were pulled out while he was still living and burned before him, and then he was cut into 4 pieces and beheaded. That was the punishment for treason, and it was carried out quite extensively, but the only person, as I say, in King Philip's War that I know was drawn and quartered was Joshua Teft. The Indians were either hanged or shot for the most part. Okay, yes?
You mentioned earlier that the Indians had better guns than the English.
And initially, because the Indians depended on the flintlock for hunting.
Who'd they get them from?
The French, the Dutch, or unscrupulous English that would sell it to them. The colonies were angry with the Dutch. It's believed a lot of Dutch in Albany sold gunpowder and guns to the Indians, and also the French, because the French were the enemies of the English at that time, of course. So they did obtain them. Yes, Doug?
There was a Leonard over on Rain and Rick.
Yep.
Right almost where it comes into 44.
Yeah.
The Chili's was up that road.
Right.
And he used to service the guns.
Right.
And supply the Indians with powder and all this stuff, basically for hunting. King Philip used them all the
Right.
time. And I think he was spared during the war too.
Right.
Tom was really spared that time. He was like a real, they didn't know what they were going to do without Mr. Leonard.
I don't know if you could hear Doug, but he was saying that one of the Leonards, in fact, several of the Leonards were the first iron makers in New England. There's a dispute about that, but they essentially were. They came over from Wales and established foundries. Eventually, it was part of Taunton at the time. It's now Raynham. And Philip actually had a fishing or a hunting camp nearby at a lake, at a pond that no longer exists. It was a huge pond, but it's been either drained or dried up since then. But he became very friendly with the Leonards, and they did repair his guns and his weapons during the war. It's believed during the war. I'm not sure if it was just before the war or during the war, but they did tend to spare the Leonards, although some of the Leonards were killed. One thing that did happen during the war was that a lot of Indians had made close friendships with English, and during the war, they did not hurt one another. There's a famous example where one of Philip's neighbors in Swansea, he was very friendly with them, and he said, well, we'll never hurt them. Unfortunately, there were so many what's so-called strange Indians, strangers, like Narragansetts and other tribes that had come into the area. The Indians were mixing up a great deal, and they didn't recognize these friendships. For just the last example, and I promise, is that when Providence was attacked, Roger Williams came out and confronted the Indians. He was in his 70s at the time. He was a very courageous man. You know, we've heard of Roger Williams, the famous Roger Williams. He came out and confronted the Indians, saying, why are you doing this? We've always been friends. And they said, well, we're not going to hurt you, but we can't speak for these other Indians. And they said, you better, flee for safety, which he did. And fortunately he did, because his house, Roger Williams' house, was one of the ones that was burned when they destroyed Providence. So, as I say, some of the Leonards were harmed. And it's believed that Philip was planning to attack Taunton at the end. And the African slave Jethro, who was captured, actually was able to escape and warn them. I find this amusing. Jethro was an African slave, and he had been captured. He actually managed to escape, and he warned Taunton, and they were able to defend themselves against attack. As a reward, they gave him his freedom after 2 years. He had to serve another 2 years. Instead of saying, okay, fine, you're free now. In 2 years, we'll let you go. I find that interesting. I'll end it on that note. Okay, well, I want to thank everyone for coming. I hope I didn't ramble on too much. There's so much material I'd like to cover. I mean, I didn't cover a tenth of what I had planned to cover tonight, but I guess I'm long-winded. So, again, thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.